Into the heart of Malaysia's 2024 Madani Budget, a fiscal compass for the nation's future. What are the intricate policies that are poised to impact livelihoods, bolster entrepreneurship and stimulate economic growth? We take a closer look at the budget's multifaceted layers and its potential effects on various segments of society and business, and how the Madani Budget aims to set the stage for a brighter future. I'm Muhammad Hamdan and this is Money Matters. Hello and welcome to Money Matters on your favorite channel right here on TV3. We are also available on HD via Tonton. Now, joining us today is Chief Economist and Social Finance Head, Bank Muamalat Malaysia Berhad, Muhammad Afzanizam Abdul Rashid. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Money Matters, Afzanizam. I'm sure it's a busy time for you since the tabling of budget yesterday.
True.
Okay. Now, the Prime Minister has unveiled yet another expansionary budget at a whopping 393.8 billion ringgit for the year 2024. Now, of this amount, a record 303.8 billion ringgit has been set aside as operating expenditure, and the remaining 90 billion ringgit for development expenditure. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I think the government is trying to find a delicate balance, on one hand, the government is trying to ensure that the society will be preserved, in terms of their livelihood. Especially in the face of rising cost of living. And at the same time, they want to instill fiscal discipline, which also important to manage the expectation or confidence among the investors, among the businesses. So these are two, at times can be conflicting, but the government is trying their best to ensure that they will meet those expectations. So as a result, we see that the expectations or the projections for the fiscal deficits to narrow further in 2024. And this week the government has also the Parliament has passed the bill of Fiscal Responsibility Act, which puts up these parameters that will ensure the fiscal discipline will be thoroughly monitored, managed, and these are the prerequisite, I would say, for an effective, responsible fiscal management. So I think it set the stage for sustainable, responsible kind of public finances and allowing further flexibility along the way at times.
Despite the record budget of nearly 394 billion ringgit, the fiscal deficit is seen narrowing to 4.3% of GDP in 2024 in anticipation of economic growth of around 4% at the end of this year, and then around 4 to 5% in 2024. Now, do you think the government's aim to stabilise the country's fiscal deficit at 3% by 2025 is within its grasp, or is it still too early to tell?
Well, I think Malaysia is such a small and also an open economy. And if you look at the global environment now, it's so highly uncertain. The recent forecast made by IMF, they projected 2.9% growth for global economy next year. It's actually a downward revision in the July forecast. And we also,
so the economy is slowing down globally?
Globally. So, and then we have seen, I think the latest number for IPI, it contracted 0.3% for August. So in that sense, there's going to be, a speed bump along the way, definitely. So the context of this budget is to ensure that we are able to at least to offset those any potential slowdown coming from abroad, and therefore the onus now is on the domestic sector, especially on public finance, public sector, to become the catalyst for growth. So I think that's the angle I'm looking at. But if you talk about risk, whether are we going to achieve those numbers, I think this year the government has already revised down in a way the forecast from 4% to 5% to merely close to 4%. So downside risk, the way I see it, is still very much visible. the global tight liquidity conditions is real. If you look at the US Treasury markets, it's really went up quite high recently, but only back down to about 4.6%. But yeah, I think the downside risk is visible, and therefore I think the more reason that the government needs to maintain their cost, stay the cost in terms of being supportive to the economy.
Right. Now let's move on to the government's effort to expand its revenue base a little bit. Now several measures were announced in the 2024 budget to increase the government's revenue base, including by introducing the capital gains tax at 10%, and then there's the luxury goods tax of up to 10%, and then increasing the services tax from 6% to 8%. What are your thoughts on this?
Right. Something has got to go, obviously. I mean, if you want to raise your cash transfers, I mean, the government has already announced they want to cut certain subsidies for diesel, for instance, and also they need to bump up their revenues. And looking at their projections, well, they are looking at services tax from 6 to 8%. Yeah, I think it will translate into 17.5 billion of total collection for services taxes compared to 16.6 billion. These projections taking into consideration the possible exemptions to certain sectors like F&B, telco. So with that exemption, the government is still able to, expected to collect more for what it is now. So I think it's also a reflection the strength of our consumer spending to some degree. I think the government is still looking at, even now I think the government, the labour market is already at, I would say, a full employment. And therefore, I think the chances of government to collect more taxes is there. It's just that perhaps the economic agents like households and businesses become more wary.
Non-tax revenue collection from Petronas dividend is expected to come in lower at 32 billion ringgit next year as compared to 40 billion ringgit this year. Don't you think it's time for the government to reintroduce the goods and services tax, GST, which is not included in the 2024 budget, to strengthen its revenue base and in turn help stabilize the country's fiscal deficit situation?
Right. Yeah, I think that's an ideal situation if we can have GST again. But I think the government is taking a very guarded approach or try to be gradual in the approach in terms of restoring the fiscal positions. I think if you look at the government's forecast for inflation next year, they are looking at between 2.1% to 3.6% compared to this year's forecast of 2.5 to 3%. So the trajectory is actually on the high side in terms of inflation. And given that certain taxes has been raised, for instance, services tax, as you mentioned just now, and also a reduction in subsidy for diesel, there could be some form of inflation pressure going forward, and it is being reflected in the forecast numbers. So I think perhaps they want to do away with the subsidy first, then only they will look at GST perhaps at some point in the future. But prior to that, perhaps the e-invoicing, I would say, will be a precursor to the implementation of GST.
Right. We're going to talk a little bit on the subsidy rationalisation, but before we do that, we're going to go for a quick commercial break. So don't go away, because Money Matters will be back shortly. Welcome back to Money Matters. We're still speaking with Chief Economist and Social Finance Head Bank Muamalat Malaysia, Afzanizam Abdul Rashid. Now, Afzanizam, early this year, the government allocated around 64 billion ringgit for subsidies and aid expenditure in the 2023 budget. But the figure is expected to reach 81 billion ringgit by the end of this year. To address this issue, targeted subsidies will be introduced in phases from next year onwards, including for electricity and diesel. Why no mention of petrol, which is something that the government has been talking about for quite a while recently, and also it is also something that people have been waiting to hear about.
Yeah, I think you are right to say that actually the bulk of the fuel subsidy lies with the RON 95. And we know the consumption of RON 95 is quite material among our Malaysian society. And if you look at the compositions of our consumer price index, RON 95, if I'm not mistaken, is accounted about 7.5%. So any changes to RON 95 will have a direct impact to our inflation. So I think the government is trying to manage that. But having said that, I think again, I think the approach is gradual. I think it's a signals that this is the way forward. This is the approach by this government to how they would manage the economy, the fiscal finances, and the Fiscal Responsibility Act, like I mentioned earlier on, is part and parcel of the program, so that it will set the right parameters to achieve a narrower budget deficit going forward. So I think they want to see. This is my view. I think they want to see with this diesel subsidization for subsidy, what will the impact to the inflation, and hence I think the range forecast for inflation is quite wide actually, 2.1% to 3.6%.
What's the worrying level of inflation rate for Malaysia?
Well, okay. If you look,
and what's the safe level or the comfortable level?
For me, just go back to the basic. I mean, let's go back to the what sort of average for inflation in Malaysia. If you look at from 1985 until last year, the compound annual growth rate for inflation is about 2.5% per annum.
Okay.
So that's the average.
Okay.
So if you can make sure your inflation will actually linger around that level, that should be okay. I mean, recently our actual inflation for August it's about 2%. So I think
that's a good thing.
So we are in the right trajectory. We are in the right environment. It's just that whenever you change your RON 95, it will quickly see the results in terms of the sharp rise in inflation. So I think the government is being mindful of that impact actually.
Okay, now ceiling prices on chicken and eggs will be removed to allow prices to float, while the floor price of paddy will be raised from 1,200 to 1,300 per ton. What does this mean to the average citizens? Because if they hear things like this, to them it equals to like rising prices of goods.
True. I think we need to understand what is price, what does it connote, what does it tell you. Actually, price will tell you the information on how resources should be allocated. So I think in the case of chicken and egg, the subsidy has been removed. So I think it will allow market price to actually dictate the price level.
It was a temporary measure anyway, right?
Yeah, true. So I think that sort of approach should be educate among our society, that we should go back to the market-based system to dictate the price level, because price will actually entail signals in terms of demand. If price is high, then you should slow down your consumptions, and if high prices, it actually incentivize businesses to come in and join, because there's a business very lucrative at the moment. I mean, looking at the price level, so that sort of signal should be the way. But with subsidies, that signal is being distorted. So I think this sort of I would say kind of economics 101 need to be educated among our society, that we should allow market to determine. Otherwise, it's very difficult to control prices. What matters is actually how we administer the markets. And I think the government has actually increased their allocation to beef up the Malaysian Competition Commissions, 10 million ringgit. So with that allocation, perhaps they can have improve the enforcement of the existing laws to ensure that there is no mishaps or mishandling in terms of the businesses, any malpractices that can be curbed. So the ultimate goal, the way I see it, to allow market-driven economy to thrive in that sense. So I think going forward, to become an advanced economy, these subsidies has to gradually reduce. So I think those are the steps that have been taken.
This is a step in the right direction. I think with regard to the chicken and eggs prices, the idea is to control the prices only during holidays, special
temporary
holidays,
measures,
festivities. Now, allocation for Rahmah cash aid has been raised to 10 billion ringgit for 2024, from 8 billion ringgit this year to benefit 9 million recipients. Cash handouts in Malaysia seem to be increasing year after year. Shouldn't we be reducing cash transfers and focusing on efforts to raise Malaysian salaries instead?
I think the consideration is in terms of the needs of the current environment. I mean, between short term, mid term, and long term.
But that's what we hear almost every day.
True.
Cash handouts is raised to a higher value.
But that would be the immediate remedy, to address this high cost of living. I mean, you give more transfers so that the affected families will have more resources to deal with that problems, and that's
give
for
them
the short
more
term.
Disposable income.
Right. But along the way, there must be concerted efforts to ensure this capacity building will continue, and that resonates well with development expenditure. How we can actually develop the country through education, through healthcare. So these are the long-term measures that will actually elevate our society in that sense. But in the short term, because the problem is quite real, obviously, so there is a need, there's a justification to have more cash. But I think that there must be a clear timeline, or I mean, there should be certain threshold that at some point this cash transfers program will actually reduce over time, because we are able to uplift our level of economic activities,
and salaries especially.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, details are scarce on this one, but an EPF flexible account, which can be accessed by members at any time, will be introduced. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I think these are the reactions from the past, calamities that we had during COVID-19. I mean, prior to COVID, there has been reports, there has been indications that Malaysians are quite vulnerable whenever they face any shocks. People have been saying that it's difficult for our household to come out with 1,000 ringgit and emergency suddenly happens.
But we're out of COVID now. Why do we still need EPF withdrawal facility?
So I suppose that's, like I said, it's a reactions to that during the COVID-19 shocks.
Okay.
But going forward, this flexibility will give them some room to maneuver. But I think more importantly is how we can educate our society.
Are you in favour of this?
Ideally, I think, we shouldn't be doing this. I mean, you will inculcate perhaps moral hazards among our society. Then,
because this is retirement savings we're talking about.
True. Again, I think therefore issues or educations on financial literacy has to really to be beefed up so that people will understand the implications of not taking care of the retirement needs going forward. Yeah.
Now we'll be touching on boosting Malaysia's TVET and small and medium enterprise ecosystems. After the break, we're going to go for a short commercial break right now. Don't go away, because we will be back shortly. Welcome back to Money Matters. We're still speaking with Afzanizam, Abdul Rashid, who is the Chief Economist and Social Finance Head of Bank Muamalat Malaysia. Now, Afzanizam, the government has set aside 6.8 billion ringgit for TVET education, with 100 million ringgit allocated to provide industry-recognised professional certification to TVET graduates as an incentive for industries to collaborate with TVET education institutions in the country. How do you think this will help drive Malaysia's economy and social development to new heights?
Sure. Right. If you look at the documents like the National Energy Transformation Roadmaps and also the New Industry Master Plan, among the key sector would be the aerospace, the electric vehicles, renewable energy, obviously. So these particular areas require some form of technical skills. And in my recent visit to Germany Malaysia Institute (GMI), I was surprised that they have a specific programs for the electric vehicles. So I think with this particular allocations, we actually can stimulate more activities to promote, or rather, more educational purposes to improve the labour supply of specific areas like the one that I mentioned just now. So I think it's a step in the right direction in terms of giving more emphasis on this particular TVET industries. Yeah.
I think it's also interesting that the government is involving industry players to help develop this TVET arena. And there were substantial financing facilities offered to micro, small and medium enterprises, MSMEs, in the 2024 budget, including the 100 million ringgit in digitalization grants to fund upgrades of sales, inventory and digital accounting systems. How will this change the landscape of MSMEs in the country, which have been the backbone of the country's economy?
Yeah, I think this allocation will actually help to rejuvenate the MSME sectors. We know that the contribution to the economy in terms of business establishment is more than 90%. It's only right that we need to give more focus on this particular sector. And on top of that measures, I was also quite surprised that the allocation or the matching grants under iTake-Up program, which is the microfinancing, has been bumped up to 25 million ringgit. And iTake-Up microfinancing is essentially very close to our hearts as a Islamic banking institution, because we participate in it in a direct manner, and we can see how this program can actually uplift or result in social upward mobility among the B40, among the ASNAF. So I think this allocation will actually help to encourage our MSME sector to elevate themselves in terms of the productive kind of engagement in terms of their business sphere.
Especially to adopt digital technology.
Right, true.
Right? And before we go, I just want to get your economic outlook for Malaysia's next year, especially in view of the budget unveiled by the Prime Minister yesterday.
My sense is that the commitment showed by the government in terms of ensuring that the fiscal deficits continue to narrow, I think that is something that's quite positive, at least from the fixed income investor. We have seen the ownership of foreign investors in MBS keep on dwindling. I mean, the recent number, it was 35.4% for September. It used to be about 51% in 2016. So the decline, perhaps reflections that foreign investors are quite wary about the state of our fiscal positions. So with narrower fiscal targets, with the pass of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, it goes to show that the level of commitment for government to make sure that the public finance is in a healthy state going forward.
This is also in view of the economic slowdown that we will be witnessing next year, according to IMF and also World Bank.
Yeah, I think people are worried about the impact of the sharp rise in interest rates globally, and typically monetary policy works in a certain lag. It typically will take about 12 to 18 months. So I think,
and also the strengthening of US dollar,
exactly,
especially against major currencies in the world, including our currency.
So I think it's quite important to make sure that our fiscal plans are feasible, and that could have at least to provide some form of boosting some confidence for our investors that the government is committed to ensure that fiscal position is healthy, so that it will open up more opportunities and allowing more fiscal space if there is any potential slowdown to react upon it. Yeah.
Just one more last question. Do you think there is a possibility for Malaysia to see a budget surplus in the near future?
Well, I think the last time that we had budget surplus, it was during 1993 up
More than
until
20 years ago.
Yeah. So to have a budget surplus is something that we need to really understand. I think the way the government operates is not like corporates, you know. If it corporates, we want to see earnings growth, but I think for government is a different thing. What matters for the government is how they can actually facilitate the economic growth. Maybe having budget surplus may not be so ideal because it can contract the economy.
So budget surplus does not necessarily mean it's better than budget deficit, right? Yeah. It also depends on the government's ability to service its debts, right? Okay, Afzanizam, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Money Matters. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise.
Thank you. Now, for the past half an hour, you've been with us on Money Matters. If you missed the earlier part of this episode, you can also catch it up on Tonton. Be sure to join us next week, same time, same day, right here on TV3. I'm Muhammad Hamdan. Thanks for watching and have a great weekend.